What I Just Don't Read.
Hello and welcome back to my Bohemian Book Corner. My name is Max and we are here to discuss what I have just unread, what I think of it, a little bit of information about the author and whether or not I think you should check it out yourselves. Before we come on to that, very quick pickup from the last episode. I spent a bit of time saying, oh look, I've updated my list and put it into my old notebook so that I've got something moving forward that I can add to as we go along. In my excitement to tell you about that, I completely forgot to cross out Strange Conflict, which was the book that we were looking at last time. So we will begin where I should have finished last time by making a mess. Crossing that one out. There we go. Oh, and you'll probably also notice these lovely black lines down here. Just in the interest of continuity, I added all of the books that we've covered in the series so far and crossed them out already so that they are all still together in one place. There we go. So, we will be having a look at our word of the day first, which is an interesting one. I don't think it's a particularly unknown word, but it's certainly one that I only sort of came across recently, and the word is factitious. Not to be confused with fictitious, which is something that is inherently untrue or not real. Something that is factitious is something that is either man-made or fake, essentially, or contrived. So, for example, if somebody were to smile at you insincerely, that is factitious. That the smile exists is true, it is real, they are smiling, but the motivation behind it is untrue and lacking spontaneity or is purely not genuine. There you go. It'll be up here somewhere, and again, as always, take it, make it your own, and wheedle it into everyday conversation where you can. Today's book. Today's book was a recommendation from my good friend Ben. Damn you. Chips are on you next time, buddy. This is Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Before we look at the book itself, as always, just a bit of background about the author. This was written sort of later in his career, so I will try and keep this as condensed as I can, so please forgive me if I don't go in depth about some of this stuff as I normally would. Kurt Vonnegut, born on the 11th of November 1922 to Kurt Vonnegut Sr. and his wife Edith, Edith Lieber. His father and grandfather before him were architects, and his mother, the Lieber family, were one of the most prominent members of Indianapolis high society, being the owners of one of the largest breweries in the city. His family, the Vonnegut family themselves, were German immigrants who moved to America in the mid-19th century and maintained their German heritage up until the post-World War I era, at which point, understandably, that there was a reasonable amount of animosity for German descendants in the States at the time. As such, they decided to not play up that part of their lineage so much anymore. This is something that Vonnegut, obviously as he came along in the early 20s, as he grew older, felt slightly disenfranchised by. He felt that their abandonment of their hereditary roots left him feeling both rootless and ignorant. In his formative years, he puts a lot of his moral values and instruction of those parts of his psychological makeup he attributes to the time spent with the family cook, who was an African American by the name of Ida Young, and says that she taught him a lot about what would eventually form parts of his socio-political psychology, shall we say. That he had a talent for writing was pretty much in evidence. He became one of the co-editors of his high school newspaper, which was called the Shortridge Echo, and he would go on to graduate from high school in 1940 and attended Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where he intended to become an architect like his father. And I find this quite curious that his father thought that he should take on a discipline that had more used to it. I think it's because one of Vonnegut's siblings had by this point become a scientist, and I think his father would have wanted him to more follow in along those lines. Something that Vonnegut himself actually kind of sort of bent the knee to, shall we say? That's the first expression that came off the top of my head, sorry. But in the end, he took biochemistry as his major, a subject that he was very much indifferent to. While he was at university, again, he managed to land a position as a reporter and then eventually as an editor on the university paper, which was the Cornell Daily Sun. Not surprisingly, he used the paper as a soapbox to advocate his, again, increasingly socialist views on life and on politics generally, including railing against direct American involvement in World War II. This is obviously prior to the destruction of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Following this event and the entry of the US into World War II, Vonnegut, while still at university, was placed into the Reserve Officers Training Corps. This didn't last too long, as he was removed from this following the fact that because of his indifference to his studies as a biochemist, that his grades weren't particularly great, and also following the publication of a particular satirical article in the paper. As a result of these factors, it was around May 1942 that he was placed on what they called academic probation. It kind of like half expelled, if you like, and this state lasted up until early 1943, when he eventually just quit university altogether. Realising that having lost his place in the Reserve Officers training programme, that he would still be eligible to be drafted if there was another draft, he himself turned around and enlisted. Did his basic training at Fort Bragg, and would go on to being trained in the use of heavy ordnance, including things like howitzers, and also got some additional training at engineering college as well. Throughout 1943, he was never actually deployed overseas. So in early 1944, he was moved from the unit, the regiment that he was in, to the 106th Infantry Division because of the slow build-up of manpower in preparations for the D-Day landings. Again, he was not deployed overseas for D-Day. I know I haven't really touched on much on his parents and his other family life in this. While he was still in training in the States, he was given leave to return home for Mother's Day in May 1944, where he discovered that on the eve of May Day, his mother had taken her own life through an overdose. The reasons for this that are generally cited are the news that he was imminently going to be deployed overseas, coupled with the fact that the family had lost much of their fortune as a result of the Great Depression, and also her lack of success as an author. I mention it here because it's noteworthy. It's one of those pivotal moments for Vonnegut that would again go on to shape his own outlook on life. So the 106 were eventually deployed overseas in December 1944 to take part in the last major German offensive of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, which for the Americans was something of a disaster, resulting in upwards of 19,000 US casualties. The 106 themselves were placed in what was termed a quiet corner of the battle, owing to their relative inexperience in combat. Even so, they were overrun by the Germans, and the division themselves lost upward of about 500 soldiers, and with almost 6,000 being taken captive, Vonnegut included. That kind of brings us with that onto the period that is mostly covered by the book. So I'll talk about that a bit more and those events in more direct relation to when we look at the book itself. Obviously, Vonnegut didn't survive the war, survived being a prisoner of war, and was eventually repatriated to the US, where on the 1st of September 1945 he married his childhood sweetheart, Jane Marie Cox, with whom he would go on to have 3 children. Also, in the years after the war, he would go on to adopt his 4 nephews, following the tragic death of his sister from cancer, and shortly after that, the death of her husband from a car crash. He spent some time as a struggling writer, and obviously as a family man, having quite a few mouths to look after. He then returned to university, as did his wife as well. Vonnegut then studied for a master's in anthropology, and supported themselves by doing night work for the City News Bureau of Chicago. His first novel, Play a Piano, was published in 1952, and he would go on to write another 4 novels before Slaughterhouse 5. His work was generally well received, but none of it was a commercial success. In 1959 and in 1963, he was nominated for a Hugo Sci-Fi Award and for a Hugo Fantasy Award, respectively, for the works The Sirens of Titan and Cat's Cradle. Then we come on to Slaughterhouse 5 itself, which I understand was written around 67-68 and was published on the 1st of July 1969. This is the book that catapulted him into the limelight and pretty much made his name and secured his career as a novelist. I don't want to really say too much more than that, because that kind of, as I've been doing with these, brings us up to date with where he was at the time that this book was released. So we'll begin, as I normally do, with these, in giving you a little bit of the blurb off the back, which is pretty simple. I can read all of it out, really, on this one. Slaughterhouse 5, Prisoner of War, Optometrist, Time Traveller. These are the life roles of Billy Pilgrim, a hero of this latter-day Pilgrim's Progress, a miraculous, moving, bitter and funny story of innocence faced with the apocalypse. It is the most original anti-war novel since Catch-22. And then there's a list of sound bites from different journalists, which I may kind of touch on in a bit. Okay, so let's start. Before I kind of talk about what I think about it, let's just discuss the book itself. This is the story of Billy Pilgrim, a fictitious, if you like, self-insert for Vonnegut in the events that he experienced and witnessed as a prisoner of war and working as a conscripted labourer in Dresden at the time that Dresden was firebombed in February 1945. The book itself thematically deals with things, aside from the obvious, like the war itself, but also what is generally accepted to be a satirical look at the notions of things like free will, death itself, and it is told in a very non-linear fashion, with our protagonist technically quantum leaping backwards and forwards through his own timeline. Introduced with an introductory chapter, which kind of addresses why it took so long after these events for Vonnegut to properly put pen to paper and construct the novel itself. Okay, so I'm reading this, 54 years after it was first released. Having grown up in a very different world to the one that Vonnegut lived in at the time that he wrote this, and at the time of the experiences depicted in it. I didn't enjoy this book, and I don't think it's a book that you're meant to enjoy. I would actively and quite vehemently disagree with whoever was the New York Times book reviewer, who stated on the back here, "An extraordinary success. It is a book we need to read and reread, funny, compassionate and wise." I'd have to disagree. This isn't a badly written book. And this is not a cleverly written book. Obviously, Vonnegut knew his craft. And the main problem I have with this is that Vonnegut's own political bias is so pronounced in this that you can't ever escape it, that it actually damages it as a piece of literature, or as a story. Your characters lose any kind of reality. And I mean, that's, I don't know if that is in some respect part of it, but you can't escape his political agenda in this. Honestly, I feel like I almost don't need to have the the special kind of glasses that if you wear them for long enough give you a headache. That if I were wearing them, I'd expect to see not lots and lots of lovely prose, I'd expect to see the Allies were cunts on pretty much every page, and war is bad and humans are arseholes. It's actually what is written on each of these pages. And that's what it feels like. I have no problem with the notion that all standards are open to scrutiny and that everything that you perceive is open to being questioned. I have no problem with that. If you're going to do those kind of things, then I think you have to approach the subject matter impartially, and you have to be impartial and accord both sides equal treatment and an equal amount of distance from them. This doesn't, and he actively doesn't. He will take time to, not going into grotesque detail, but certainly into enough detail to cast aspersions on his own side, on the Americans, as and cite things that would be, which are war crimes committed by the American GIs in occupied France, but will say nothing about the atrocities perpetrated by the Germans. Now, in some respects, you can argue that the actual events themselves that are depicted in this book occurred about a month after the Battle of the Bulge, but this was still, again, at the time that they occurred, these characters wouldn't have been aware, but certainly by the time he was writing this book, he would have been aware, because about 3 weeks before the bombing of Dresden, the Allies liberated Auschwitz, and were beginning to get an understanding of the scale of the atrocities that were committed there. Beyond a slightly casual reference to the grisly origins of the soap that they were given in the prisoner of war camp, he says nothing about it. The bias is so strong that the whole work itself comes across as feeling superficial and slightly insincere. And now I know one of the things that Vonnegut is, his kind of style is, aside from being a sci-fi writer, is also as an exponent of sort of graveyard humour. But there's no humour in it. If I'm reading it with the wrong kind of eyes, then I'm reading it with the wrong kind of eyes. But I didn't see anything in this that made me smile, even in the most wryest of sense. And I have no problem with black humour at all. I actually quite enjoy it. I didn't get that from this. As I say, there's so much time spent rubbishing, in particular the Americans as a military force. You have a section here where you have a dying American colonel shouting out to his men, trying to maintain some kind of, keep their morale up, and this is in the last moments of his life, and these are presented, and the lens that he chooses to present these from paint this man as a pathetic figure. Now, it's easy to stand back from the safety of your desk where you're writing 20 years later and point a finger at that. But as somebody who lived through that, witnessed that, and knew that possibly the people who were around him needed that to be able to carry on themselves, that's a bit below the belt for me. And again, please don't get me wrong. I should say at this point, I don't wish to attack Vonnegut as a man. That would be churlish of me to do that. I have not been through the experiences that he went through. I did not have to shovel the dead after the firebombing of Dresden into a pile for the Germans to then reduce to ashes with a flamethrower because there were simply too many bodies to bury. I have not lived those experiences. I can understand, in that respect, what that must have done to him to put him in, to eventually write this. It didn't carry the gravitas that I think that it had when it was first released. I should probably also say here, if you've been following this series up to now, then you'll know that for me, reading is as much about the escapism of it as opposed to imparting any kind of political indoctrination. That doesn't interest me. It's why I've never really had a problem with separating art from artist. As if you do your work properly, and if it's a good piece of art and a good piece of work, good for you. You can go and believe what you want as long as you're not actually going out and actively harming people. Everything about this and the way this is written is designed to address this audience from a very left-wing point of view. And even though I'm aware myself, and again there will be images up here to illustrations of political compasses that I've done myself that will show that I identify as left-wing libertarian. I can't see that this has anything positive to teach the reader. If you want to read it in terms of a piece of work to learn about the events of Dresden, then there is value in that, in here to read. But I'm sure in terms of actual factual information, you're probably better to go and read a history book than to read this, because the experiences are muted to a degree. And it's not helped as well by the fact that our protagonist is he seems to have any lack of agency. This is a man who is experiencing his life in, as I said, a very non-linear fashion, but never makes any attempt to alter his fate or to alter the events around him, which you'd think somebody who's in the unique position of seeing things in that kind of non-linear sense would have the opportunity to do. But again, the writer does not allow him to do so, which kind of makes him come off as being a bit bland. Again, this is looking at it purely as a literary work, not as a political work. Yeah, which kind of makes him come off a bit bland and uninteresting. The other thing that I find with this as well is Vonnegut has a tendency, again, as part of, and this is one of the slightly more insidious elements of the books, is that he, as I was saying earlier, he needs to be a bit more impartial in terms of how he's touching on this, on his subject matter. And I reinforce that by the fact that towards the end of the book, he does introduce the concept, or he does allow for different interpretations about how justified the Allies were in destroying Juste, considering where they were at that stage of the war. Which was like, oh, that's cool. Until you take a second and you realise that the characters that he has putting forward this counterpoint are portrayed in such a light as to make them odious, and is written in such a way that, if this is an opinion that you share, he kind of works to tar you with the same brush. And that's not clever. That's, I mean, this is speaking as somebody who generally, as I said, doesn't read particularly didactic books. And yet, even to me, that was transparent, what you were trying to do. So, that's why, again, like I say, I didn't enjoy this. When you do that, then you invite scrutiny of yourself. Again, as I said, that's why I made the point about being able to separate art from artist. When you make things so political like this, then you can't help but go, well, what about you? You say you're trying to preach to people here. How good were you at living up to the ideals that you're saying that others should follow? And as it turns out, from what little I have been able to find out in the time that I had to prepare for this, not very well, I'd have to say. If you look here somewhere, there should be a scan of, if you just type into Google, Kurt Vonnegut politics, there will be this list of what he's commonly perceived as his political ideology. In amongst this, you will see that he's cited as an anti-capitalist. If you then put into Google, Kurt Vonnegut net worth, at the time of his death in 2007, Vonnegut had amassed a fortune of $114 million. The majority of which from the sale of this book. For an anti-capitalist and a socialist, capitalism seems to have done him very well. Especially when you consider that this book was released on, as I said, on the 1st of July 1969, at the height of anti-war sentiment in America for Vietnam. Now, again, I don't know whether that was him or whether that was his publishers, but either way, if this book should stand the test of time now, possibly it should stand so as an example of genius marketing, because he's literally published this into the absolute perfect zeitgeist, to the point that you may as well have printed bestseller on the first edition. That kind of hypocrisy is going to make me go, nah, why should I believe anything you could say? I do know from some of the research that I did that he tried to kind of downplay that in an interview by saying that the only person who benefited from the destruction of Dresden was one person, himself, because he made some money off it. Yeah, you did. I don't really think I've got really anything to say about it beyond that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and do my eye things first. I think now I'm going to do that now before I give my recommendations and stuff, because I think that might kind of bookend those bits together a bit more. So you all stay safe in a bunker beneath a slaughterhouse while I go and do this. Ooh, sticky fingers. Sorry. Okay, we'll come to that in a second. There was one final point I did want to make, and then again, this I will have to quote from the book itself. And this also kind of highlights part of why I didn't enjoy this. It's from towards the end of the book. And he says, Billy stayed in the wagon when it reached the slaughterhouse, sunning himself. The others went looking for souvenirs. Later in life, the Tralfamadorians would advise Billy to concentrate on the happy moments of his life and to ignore the unhappy ones, to stare only at pretty things as eternity failed to go by. When I read that, I was put very much in mind of the subtext of the rather... I'm going to use the word odious because I did find it was a bit odious. Netflix movie Bird Box. Don't look at the bad things. Just concentrate on the good. Just concentrate on the nice things that can't hurt you. Yeah, unfortunately, life's not like that. Sorry. If you want to grow and become anything, you need to look at the bad things that are happening and meet them head on. That's what it means to be alive. Would I recommend this book? My understanding from my friend Sam is that this is one that turns up quite a lot on reading lists in schools in the States. Not so much here in the UK. You know, the chances are you've probably read it if you're watching this in the States anyway. No, I'd say again, I mean, as I've already said, I don't think there's enough really in here in terms of what it does actually cover about Dresden itself to get any practical historical knowledge out of it. If your own political ideology aligns with Vonnegut's, then you will probably enjoy it. If it doesn't, then you probably won't. And as I said at the start, this is one of those books that I'm not sure whether you're supposed to enjoy. I will put a link to it where you can find it, as always. Based on that, as you can probably tell, when we go to the eye ratings... Oh, yes! I do now have a third eye, a properly middle-sized eye, so that I can do this properly. I have used the right one there, haven't I? Yes, I believe so. Anyway, yeah. So, I've given it a 2 in terms of its quality as a book. 3 for this particular copy itself. This is an ex-library copy. It's a little bit battered, and obviously, yeah, but it's got the nice little protective dust jacket on it. And I must admit, I do actually quite like the cover art. And again, as an edition, it was pretty good. You know, there wasn't that many, if any, typos in there at all. So, as a product, that's probably the best, probably the nicest thing I can say about it. We will do the needful and cross it off the list, properly killing it dead. There it is, or there it was. We can get rid of that. In the words of the author himself, so it goes. So, what's up next? Let's turn our attention to something a little bit different, and I feel like I do after that need to kind of clean my palate somewhat. To which end, we will turn back to one of my favourite literary subjects, which is the undead. QU. In particular, sorry, I kind of lost myself again for a minute there. Oh, we'll do that in a second. Sorry, hold on, I've got a thing for that. We'll do that in a second. Anyway, next up, so this was a lend from my good buddy Sam, and this is called A Morbid Initiation by Philippe Boulle. This is book 1 of 3 in a trilogy of books set in the world of darkness, setting Vampire the Masquerade, specifically the Victorian Age vampire setting. Again, don't know anything about the author, don't know anything about the book, and as I said, it is a trilogy. At the moment, I'm going to read this one and then probably read something else and come back to it, but if you'd be interested in me reading all 3 books and then doing reviews for each sequentially, please let me know in the comments. If enough people ask for it, then I will read all 3 together. But that's what I'm going to be doing next, is making myself cosy in the final box that I shall ever inhabit. Before I do that, we're going to turn this around. So what we've got, after that, another suggestion from another friend of mine was to have a look at the works or the journals of Dan Eldon. He was a British Kenyan photojournalist working in Somalia and was stoned to death following the events that Somalis referred to as Black Monday in 1993. 92, it might be 93, I'm sorry, I'm not too sure on the dates there. But he had, I think, a collection of 4 journals posted. 4 journals were published posthumously. So if you know anything about them, if you can recommend any of them, as always, leave it in the comments below. Once I've got a few, I'll pick one and add it to the list. That's us done. And again, and I'm sorry if I'm a little bit carried away on this one, but this is why I don't read political books, because they take me to a place that I don't like to go. I'm going to go, as I said, and sink my teeth literally into that. And until next time, get thee gone.
I don't like this one bit.
Leave it alone, man.
He initially wanted to follow in his father's and his grandfather's footsteps and become the architect sketch. The architect sketch.